Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Lewis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us.
Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Lewis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. It's my privilege today to introduce to you Dr. Aaron Smith. We're going to be discussing this theme, this topic by this title, Conflicts Between Faith and Science. Are they all in the head? Dr. Smith is Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of Research for the Center for the Study of Human Behavior at California Baptist University. Dr. Smith's research includes an emphasis in science and religion, including the following. So please take note, I was really struck by this. Cultural and cognitive explanations for the development and differentiation of fantastical, scientific, and religious concepts. If we have time, I'd like to know more about what is meant by fantastical. That's fascinating to me. So also the relation between scientific knowledge and religious concepts. And then lastly, the contribution and limits of science, especially neuroscience, philosophy of science. Now, there are other aspects to Dr. Smith's work, but these are the ones I'm focusing on today for the purposes of this interview. Again, the title, Conflicts Between Faith and Science, Are They All in the Head? I actually had the privilege of meeting Dr. Smith, was it a year ago or 2 years ago now? I can't remember when it was, Aaron.
It was about halfway between, about a year and a half, yeah.
That's right. So down in California, we were both are serving as advisors for the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Science for Seminaries initiative with St. John's Seminary in California, Catholic Seminary. And just a real delight in working with Dr. Smith, her as a science advisor, myself as a theology advisor for St. John's Seminary and our colleagues there. So again, thank you for joining us for New Wine Tastings today, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So this is one of the areas of interest where trying to find the right questions to ask is very daunting. I really was wrestling through this last night as I was preparing questions, Aaron. And fools rush in, as they say, where angels and psychologists fear to tread. And still, I'll take that risk and I'll take the leap of faith and ask away with some measure of fear and trembling, ultimately because the resulting stress on my brain might lead me to require therapy. But my first question is, what are some of the psychological factors that contribute to people taking a pro-faith or pro-science stance over against the other? So pro-faith over science, pro-science over faith stance. What is it that leads to that? And then on a related brainwave frequency, how often are the factors more psychological when we think about conflict thesis and faith and science? In your estimation, how often are they ultimately psychological rather than really bound up with faith or science? And how we are wired in terms of our biases? Is it really a matter of scientific or faith conviction? So, Dr. Smith, I'm looking forward to your answers to these questions.
All right, those are great questions. So one thing that I stress all the time with my students is that work, especially in developmental psychology, which is where my training started, but this is true of psychology as a field, is that we have to be careful not to assign singular causes. Whenever we're talking about something as complex as human thinking and human behavior, which I've just given you the intro to psych definition of psychology, right? The study of human thinking and behavior. As soon as we want to try to explain what people are doing, why they're doing it, and predict what they might do in the future, we have to acknowledge that those choices are multiply determined and underspecified. And so as soon as we want to say, this is why something happens, we've probably, in that singular attribution, really missed the incredible nuance that's required. But interesting, so your question about why would someone choose a pro-faith or a pro-science stance, really kind of assuming that they're mutually exclusive, that there is no pro faith and science, right? Both faith in science and how it works, but also faith in a spiritual reality that, what would put someone in one of the camps where it's either or. And what I think is interesting is one of those factors is the exact thing that psychologists should try to avoid, is the determination of a single cause. That when we take these stances that essentially suggest there is one explanation and it's a simple, straightforward, easy to grasp, no nuance, applies across the board, those kinds of stances tend to contribute to people saying, this is my framework for the world and let's not muddy it up, right? Like, I grew up as a Christian, this is how I understand it, and you're trying to bring in some new ways of even thinking about scripture, but I don't want to do that. And again, that's not a conscious thought, because I have my single answer for all the things that are important in my life. That leads to this almost protective layer that people put on to say, no, I don't need that information because I have my explanatory system here. And where there is conflict, it's because you're wrong because my explanatory system is working. But of course, I've kind of, in this example, given an example of somebody saying, religious faith and the cost of rejection of science, but it works the same way in some scientific communities where it's like, no, this is my scientific perspective. And I, because religion deals with things that I can't test in the laboratory, my worldview is isolated, protected. I don't need that. And so I'm not even going to entertain that. And you're kind of foolish for having done so. But I have my worldview, and it might be a little more nuanced because that's built into the scientific method, but it's still the explanation of how the world works with a singular cause, in the sense of a singular method, right? A singular way of knowing, without really acknowledging the limits to how we know through science, right? Science is an incredible tool, but it's also not the only tool in the toolbox by which we understand the world we live in. It has kind of a very specific application. And so I think this kind of either or, there's one or the other, let's keep things simple and straightforward, which is good for things like science communication, right? You want a simple, straightforward, cohesive message. But if we're talking about, let's understand the nature of reality, right? How does the world work? What is the nature of what is true? That's going to require a little bit more than a Twitter hashtag, right? It's going to require a little bit more nuance than that. And as soon as we say, no, I don't want that nuance, and again, it's often unconscious to an individual that they're making that choice, we're really entering into dangerous territories where we're perverting possible information that might further develop our understanding of the way the world works. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And of course, in the context of this whole conversation, everything I say, if I ever say, like, this is a reason why, know that behind that statement, I'm saying this is one of many contributing factors. And at this point, we don't really know what is necessary and what is sufficient, right? What are kind of the combination of required factors, but we can paint the landscape of, these are certain psychological tendencies, these are certain cultural factors that contribute to this kind of artificial siphoning and separation of, like, this is true and this is not, and that kind of process.
Thank you very much. And, I am assuming our viewers and listeners understand that we're not affirming per se the conflict thesis that faith and science have to be in conflict with one another. We don't think that is the case, that they have to be. They are often pitted against one another in various communities. We don't share that view that it should be. And that's what we're trying to get at. What causes that? What are some of the factors or many of the factors? I didn't pose this question in terms of what I had sent to you in advance, but just following up on what you just shared, Aaron, can psychology, while the factors are multitudinal, that can give rise to why someone approaches these matters by way of conflict, while the factors, the causes, if we can use the word causation, the factors can be multitudinal, or there might be a multiplicity of factors. Can psychology still indicate what all those factors are, or would it say that psychology would say, well, some of these areas we don't have the authority or the expertise to even touch upon. So when you talk about a variety of factors, can psychology still note what they are? Or you say, well, we can only engage some factors. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, it does. It does. So I think that psychology can identify those factors and can articulate kind of the field of contributing factors. So there's something really interesting. One of the things that I love about studying psychology, especially thinking about the psyche of religion and how people understand and connect with God or the divine, is there's two questions that you can ask. So you can ask, does God exist, for example? But then you can also ask, do you believe God exists? And that second question is really independent of the first. Whether or not you believe God exists or not is independent about the actual existence of God. And so in that way, whether or not science and religious faith are actually in conflict or not, and I agree with you, I do not believe that they are. That doesn't mean there's not tricky points of touch from time to time because we don't have full access to all of the way the world works. But I don't believe that there is kind of this intractable conflict. So whether or not science or religion are in conflict is actually separate from the question of what people believe about the conflict and what contributes to that belief. And so in many ways, it's like you have, this ontogenic reality, like the way it actually is, God's eye view. And then what psychology does is we kind of approach that and we say, so how does that exist in people's minds? Knowing that we're not actually crossing that gap just because, across all cultures, across all time, lots of people have believed in God, that we could make some philosophical arguments about common sense philosophy and what that might mean for the existence of God, but that doesn't prove God exists just because a lot of people believe it. Just like if a bunch of people started to not believe in God, and we do see that in some cultures, it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, right? So there is a difference between what's in people's heads and what the reality is. But what I think is so interesting from a psychological perspective is the things that are in our head, we act on as if they're true. And so it ends up being a really important question, what people believe, because it shapes how we engage in the world in really important ways. And so I think about the conflict thesis, and one of the contributing factors to the propagation of the conflict thesis is, I like to call it the psychology of talking heads. But there are these biases where it's like, so on the screen right now, there is you and there is me. Imagine we fervently disagreed about something, right? So you have your perspective over in your box and I have my perspective in my box. We are quite literally two talking heads. But let's say that my position was one that very few people shared. Like there's no evidence for it. Not many people believe it, but
that's my normal state of affairs, Aaron. That's my normal state of affairs.
I didn't want to pin that on you, so I'll take that position this time. And then you're representing a position that everybody agrees with, right? That there's so much evidence for it. So you have 97% of the population behind you, and I have 3%. But the problem is that by putting us side by side, it makes it communicates to viewers that it's a 50-50 split. So climate science is a really great example of this. As soon as you have somebody who kind of endorses climate science and somebody who doesn't, and you put them side by side, it gives the impression that climate science is on not so firm footing. Like, well, you can take it or leave it. You can go to the blue box or you can go to the white box. You take your choice. Right. But in reality, when you look at the actual distribution of individuals who say, yeah, climate science is legitimate, it's trustworthy, there's lots of data from different perspectives converging on the same conclusion, that's a 97.3% split. But it's not communicated that way culturally because of this kind of artificial presentation of opposing sides. And that's one of the things that the conflict thesis does. So even though very few religious believers and very few scientists are at the extremes like a Ken Ham and a Richard Dawkins, most people are closer to the middle. It communicates at a cultural level that actually there are these two boxes and you better put yourself in one if you're going to be in the community of scientists or the community of believers. And so even though most people are somewhere in the middle, that's not actually what's communicated. And so it perpetuates this kind of siphoning to the sides and really the polarization of perspectives around the possible cooperation between science and religious faith.
And we see that in other domains too, like even with the coronavirus, right? You can have two people on the screen, Dr. Fauci and someone else represent another view because there are two views presented. We think it's 50-50, whereas in actual fact, it's not. I don't think it's just from our vantage point. I think the facts are indicating that this is for real. Please wear a mask, in other words. And so that's helpful, though, the way in which our minds are wired in terms of the talking heads and things of that sort. Moving forward with this discussion, Dr. Smith, how often do the communities in which we are immersed shape our thinking, including our biases regarding faith and science? I'm often saying how often, what are some, trying to nuance this, whether I'm nuancing enough, I'm trying to account for that. But again, how often do the communities of faith or science, and if we talk about science involving faith, commitments, judgments, not in a vacuous kind of way, and I think the same about the object of faith for religious people. It's not vacuous in terms of our rationale, but how do our communities shape us? To what extent, I should say?
Yeah, that's such a good question. One of these fundamental questions that graduate students still get asked in developmental psychology is, so which is it, nature or nurture, right? Are you the product of your genes and these kind of personal contributing factors, or is there something in the external world that is ultimately kind of shaping the trajectory of your development? And I think that the reason we still ask this question is because it raises some really fundamental philosophical questions about what we think and how we interpret data around human development. But of course, any answer that tried to put a stake in one flag would probably be rejected by the committee, because it is neither a nature nor a nurture question. It's a question of how do they interact, in what circumstances, what is their relative contribution? So your question's a really good one. But one of the things that, because cultural influences, the influence of our community would be in that nature category, or that nurture category. But one of the things that research shows is that even these most fundamental biological things are influenced by culture, right? So you can look at differences, there's cross-cultural differences in our perceptual capacities, right? The way that we see the world around us. Pretty straightforward biological, but if you ask individuals in an American context, and then you ask individuals in a Chinese, more interdependent culture, kind of collectivistic cultural context, they look at these pictures and then you ask them to reproduce the pictures, kind of describe what they saw, they paint different scenes. They saw the exact same stuff, right? Same physical stimuli entered into their brain to be processed, but they interpreted it differently. And so what's to account for that? The cultural lens through which it was interpreted. So if that's true for something like how I make sense of the city scene right outside my window, how much more true is that going to be of something that is most decidedly psychological, what I believe, right? And so we see the impact of culture broadly, but then also our individual sociocultural contexts, kind of at all aspects of what it means to be human, ranging again from these very fundamental kind of biological mechanisms up through things that are psychological. So when it comes to this question of science and faith, of course there's going to be an impact of culture, but it's not a singular impact, right? There's multiple layers to this. So for example, we can talk about explicit views, right? So these are the talking heads on the screen. We can talk about what families say, we're Christians, we don't believe that, or, we're not Christians, we don't believe that, or, whatever the case is. So you can have this kind of explicit communication that happens in families, in communities, in churches, in schools, right? So you have that kind of formation, and that matters. At the same time, we have another layer of implicit beliefs. So these are things that are outside of our conscious awareness. Your viewers may have had some exposure to things like implicit racial bias, right? And the impact of that on kind of explicit behavior and choices. And so that's a really important area of research, but it doesn't just apply to race. And so there's been lots of research on implicit bias having to do with race, with gender, with body shape and weight, with age. And I think that there is some real potential for thinking about other types of categories, because essentially implicit bias is a measure of your affinity toward or rejection of certain social categories. And so a social category could be what it means to be a scientist, or what it means to be a Christian or a religious believer. And so even if we have an explicit belief like, oh, science and religion, they're cool, they can get together. If we exist in a cultural context where there is a strong propagation of a conflict thesis, that can create an implicit bias of a conflict thesis, because some of the work on implicit bias essentially argues that it is kind of like a marking of your cultural environment on your brain. It's like a thumbprint, right? This is the culture I'm in. Whoop. And so even though you might explicitly reject those views, it doesn't mean that the views of your culture haven't, I'm going to use the word infiltrate, which sounds very intentional and insidious, but it doesn't mean the views of your culture that might propagate a conflict thesis, that they haven't also infiltrated your beliefs in a way that you might kind of question, should I take that second science class, right? If I'm a good Christian. And of course, that's not a meaningful question, but when you exist in a cultural context, even if it explicitly rejects science as unsafe for religious believers, there might still be some impact in terms of I have this pull toward or against certain types of behaviors. And so the question of how much of it is psychological, all of it, right? All of it is funneled through what it means to be human, right? Even data, right? Data are, we could say they exist, they are these numbers, but as soon as we want to make sense of the numbers, we are now engaging in a psychological activity, and those numbers are filtered through all sorts of cultural worldviews, all sorts of identity functions, all sorts of implicit and explicit biasing functions, some normal cognitive biases, right? There's all sorts of ways for things to go awry. It's amazing that we get anything right. But we get things right a lot of the times. And yet when we surround ourselves in these echo chambers, which are becoming increasingly comfortable, especially in social media worlds, when we surround ourselves with echo chambers, we fail to engage the checks on our reasoning that might otherwise point out when things are going awry in our reasoning systems.
Yeah, I mean, peer pressure is cognitive pressure. It's perception pressure in so many ways. I think that relates to what you're getting at. And so even if, let's say, you're in a community that doesn't think racialization is a part of our current societal structures, it doesn't, and let's say I don't hold that, but I'm in a community where that's the case. I don't hold that position. I think that racialization is a present day phenomenon. But let's say my community doesn't hold that. How I argue, how I articulate, if I'm even sensitive, it's going to shape how I'm at the least articulating to convince people otherwise. But I might even at times not speak when I should speak because not even aware of it, type of thing. I think about this stuff all the time, depending on the community I'm in. If I'm speaking to a group of white people primarily on race, I think I'd be very naive if I didn't think that there are certain dynamics in place that I have to account for in terms of maybe an unwillingness to engage as directly on the issue if I'm thinking I might get pushback. And I have to push through that. I have to push through that, but hopefully in a winsome, prophetic manner. I think about this stuff all the time on race issues. And if I'm in an African American community or an Asian American community, it's going to be a different context. Those things do shape us. And I think that relates directly to what you're saying. It might not be as impressed upon me as at other times it's impressed upon me, but it is shaping how I engage. it's shaping what I will say, it's impacting me, and I need to be very attentive to that. Would that resonate with what you're getting at, Erin?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think, one of my fervent prayers as a Christian and a scientist is that God will give me eyes to see and ears to hear. Because all of these biases that make it, that make us want to maybe shy away from something we believe in certain contexts, again, not intentionally, but that will have an impact if we have different types of discussions here, and even just angles of those discussions. So much of that comes down to our lack of ability to identify our biases in ourselves, which of course we can. It's just really, really hard, you know, and we can't fix something that we haven't seen. And so this is why I think these kinds of conversations are so important, because sometimes people don't realize that there are other options, right? Like, you don't have to believe this thing. And if you choose not to believe this thing, that doesn't mean that you suddenly have to leave your religious community, because there's lots of people, good, earnest Christians or good, earnest scientists, who disagree on some of these things that aren't necessarily like the line of being in or out of the group. But so when we become aware of these impacts on us, we can have more honest conversations, and hopefully more humble conversations, which I think is a big part that is tragically so often missing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, some people will take issue with civility today, like, you know, when people push back and say, be civil, and maybe use that as a weapon against equity.
Yeah.
I think we have to have a pursuit of civility and equity at the same time, and making sure that this is not just like dominant culture. Hey, be civil on certain matters in our culture. Am I equitable? At the same time, I think I have to have that humility, because we're all shaped, like you said, we all have biases, and the factors that lead to it, those psychology can understand them all. They're multitudinal, right? They're multifaceted. And so it's hard to shift in one's thinking, for me or for anyone else. So I have to have some empathy. I have to have some humility. I have to have some, you know, give people a bit of space to wrestle. Hopefully they give that to me as well. And we find so little of that today in these echo chambers across the spectrum in our society, as you were alluding to a few minutes ago. We've covered a lot of cultural ground already this morning. We've talked about, you know, faith and science. We got into certain areas of science. We've talked about race. These things are not just in one particular domain. They influence everything in society, because we're all present and we all bring our minds to bear on everything we're engaging on, all the cultural topics, including religion and science. So you had mentioned in prior exchanges that we've had that binary thinking, which involves a lack of ambiguity and complexity, makes a difference in prejudicing people to be pro-science or pro-faith. And we don't have time today to get into all the nitty-gritty about what does it mean to be pro-science, or what does it mean to be pro-faith. That in of itself could be a discussion or two or three. So I'm just going to accept those categories as basic for now, just to have the discussion on psychology engaging faith and science. But the binary thinking, from what I've gained from you, does make a difference in prejudicing people to be pro-science or pro-faith to the exclusion of the other. If that is so, then the two conflicting sides may actually be closer to one another than they would ever wish to admit. That, you know, binary thinking so often stands in the way of us having real discourse. And so anyway, it's like the talking head complex that we had mentioned earlier. Could you please unpack your claim?
Yeah.
And about binary thinking, and how might people and communities adapt their thinking strategies, myself included, to allow for more ambiguity and complexity, and thereby move toward a more constructive approach to faith and science and other themes that we discuss and debate over in our society today?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I mean, the person who can articulate exactly how to do this is going to have a very rich rich life, right? They will solve the problem of higher education, among other things. Because one of the things
Well, that's your job today. You're going to solve it today. You're going to solve it for us.
Sorry, I'm not solving that problem today. But this question of how do we move individuals from this or that, or this kind of black or white thinking, to this place of I can wrestle with nuance and I can hold things as true, but with a slightly open hand, meaning it is not impenetrable to additional evidence. That is a really, really tough question, right? It's a question of how do we equip individuals to think critically about the information both that they hold and that is coming to them. But then, of course, it's not just about the information coming to you, because that might just all be consistent with what you already believe. It's also equipping them to evaluate evidence and seek out evidence to the contrary. In many ways, it is a question of how do we train individuals to think scientifically about problems, right? Because one of the core features of science is the ability to show something is incorrect, right? Falsifiability. And that what counts as falsifiability when we're talking about a religious belief is going to look different than what counts as falsifiability in a chemistry lab, but the same underlying principles can still apply as we think about, does this perspective, does this viewpoint illuminate more of the world, right? Like a scientific theory, does it make interesting predictions? Does it answer some questions, even if there's not proof in the scientific sense? But that kind of thinking, I think, involves nuance, because now we are articulating in a very explicit way some of these underlying beliefs that we might have that are that kind of incline us to take an easy answer or not, right? So I think that's a really important question. Of course, it's a really difficult question, and it's compounded by the fact that in psychology, we have this term called an individual difference variable. And so it's quite literally just the ways that you and I differ from one another. So we can talk about personality, for example, as this individual difference variable. I can give you a big 5 inventory. That's kind of the standard personality, the dominant personality theory. And I can, chart where you are on these big 5 personality characteristics, and I can do the same for myself. And we can say, oh, hey, look, you're really high over here. I'm really low over here. We differ in that variable. And there are aspects of personality that incline some people more than others to black and white thinking. There are some individuals that even within the same cultural context, even within the same family, they have certain genetic predispositions that make them more tolerant of ambiguity, right? That they don't need the answer right now. They're able to go to sleep just fine, knowing that there is a whole mess of information that they have not yet sorted out. And some individuals really like that they have this need for closure, is kind of the other end of that spectrum, where they would much rather tie the bow on the present, even if it's been kind of very quickly wrapped up and is probably not the right, complete explanation, because it helps them sleep better at night, right? Here, sleep being a metaphor for being at peace with your understanding of the world. And so it's not just that we're trying to move people culturally, but we have to acknowledge that we come into these exchanges different, with different personality distribution. So there's this interaction of what I bring to the situation, what's in me, what pre-existed, and then how that has interacted over my developmental history, and then also where I am right now. And so it's this really kind of complicated mess of things. But I think that one of the best ways that we can move people away from black and white thinking is assuring them that having more complex beliefs won't change who they are. I think it's so interesting when we think about, so there's a lot of work on science rejection, especially in the United States. And one of the things that this research has demonstrated is that sometimes people will reject science because they're afraid of what it means for who they are. And that seems like a really odd jump if you kind of step back and think about it. So if I say, yes, the climate is warming, and now suddenly I don't know who I am, and it exerts this existential crisis, that seems like kind of an odd jump, kind of at face value. But really, it's because who we are is nested inside a community. And to the extent that we share these beliefs, if I change my beliefs, do I have to step outside that community? Or is there space for diversity? And so this is why I think stressing and having examples, both historical and current, of individuals who have not represented the extremes, but have managed to say, look, I am a practicing Christian. I am also a practicing scientist. And it works, right? Like I can be both of these things. The more examples we have of that, inherent in that is diversity, that we can point to examples and say, look, that person is a Christian and they believe this, that person is a Christian and they believe that. And they're both still in this community, both of science and of Christian community. They're still in the church. And so to the extent that we can expand what it means to be in a group, I think that we can at least implicitly encourage away from it's one or the other. It's this or it's that, which is that kind of binary thinking that we want to kind of move away from. And this, I think, would be greatly helped by both scientists and religious leaders being willing to engage nuance. I get that if you want to have a 15-minute sermon, or if you want to have a really active Twitter feed, you have to condense it. You have to kind of like cut out some of the details, but we have to create spaces in these communities to allow for complicated dialogue, to say, let's try to map out all these features and let's have these open-handed discussions where it's not about winning, it's not about persuasion, it's just about knowing and talking. And then eventually over time, that kind of safe space might actually lead to real belief change, right? Or to an increasing comfort with ambiguity, rather than this kind of artificial sense that we actually have control over this world. I think a pandemic has shown us that there's so much we don't have control over, right? And it's just, that's one of the things that has made this hard, is we're staring that reality in the face. And we as a culture have been ill-equipped to handle that kind of, we don't know what's coming next. And so the science religion dialogue, I think, could really benefit from promoting this, like, let's just have a conversation open-handed, to allow there to be ambiguity, even if we don't tie the bow on the box tonight.
Right. And, just further to what you're saying, and thank you very much, those are very concrete recommendations, I believe. You mentioned, can we find examples of those who've actually been able to stay centered in a particular tradition or as individuals, but still engage broadly? So are they centered yet diverse in their engagement? And so we'll look for examples from history or present tense, where actually, like on Faith and Science, Francis Collins is a devout Christian, right? And he is a major scientific figure. Yeah. It can be done, in other words. So you can look at someone currently and say, here's an example, or in history, here's an example on Faith and Science. Also, the matter of, even if someone we disagree with shows a willingness. I remember when I have students read Charles Darwin, and they are amazed by, because they have views of him. Mm-hmm. But when they read him and they see the humility of how he acknowledges gaps in his thought, that kind of attracts them to him in terms of like, I can engage this. I think back to your point on humility, if we can see the other side, whatever the side is, and for, I have students on a variety of sides on these topics with Faith and Science, but, if we see humility on the other side of the spectrum, I think that also helps us to get beyond our own binary. Say, well, if they can do it, I can do it. Or if we have people in our own tradition, they can do it, I can do it. Our scriptures, do we see an allowance for ambiguity? When I teach on world religion, just as an example, I like to go to Paul on Mars Hill. Mm-hmm. Here he is grieving over idols, and yet quoting from a hymn to Zeus. Yeah. To say that this is speaking about the one true God. And it's like, wait a minute, he did what? And he did what? And yet he centers it all in the narrative of Jesus, that God would judge the world through this one who was raised from the dead. I think drawing to those sacred texts of authority where we can show that ambiguity and yet the centeredness is key. And so I think that's very helpful. And then to build that into our communities where we don't thwart people's views or despise people or humiliate or shame people. We can have strong views, but always to admit we don't see everything, and always to make sure that they feel safe in community. I think otherwise we just go into the echo chamber and have churches and schools that are just basically echo chambers, and that doesn't reflect what the body of Christ is to be. So just moving.
Can I jump in, because you hit on something in this area of research? There's this phrase called value congruence, and one of the things that this research has suggested is that if you want to communicate something to someone else, they are much more likely to accept what you have to say when you start from a place of agreement. And so, for example, if you want to communicate about climate change policies, if you are talking to someone who is more liberal, you're going to approach that conversation differently than if you're talking to someone who's more conservative. Maybe you're going to pitch the climate change policy in the context of a free market solution, right? And so you have to frame it differently. You don't pervert the content. That's not what I'm saying. You're still genuine to the content, but you think about what is a place where we can start that we agree on. And so especially in religious communities, I think starting with who Jesus is really important. We can agree on that and we can go out from there. But if you are talking to someone who is not in a religious community, starting with Jesus doesn't make sense, right? Because you don't share that value. And there's this, I love that there's a study that looks at how do we increase empathy, right? Putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Well, that's a good strategy unless you're putting yourself in someone's shoes who you don't like, right? Because you don't share values with them. That actually decreases empathy toward that person, because it's like we can't picture ourselves as someone who is fundamentally different, and our values are kind of our foundation here. And so it's really, and I think Paul sets a great example, right? You meet people where they're at, and it's going to be different roads. You might be ultimately headed to the same place, right, in the conversation, but you don't take the same path to get there. And I think that is something really important to think about. But that requires us, as someone who wants to engage in this conversation, that we are willing to check how we think the conversation ought to go. Right. That I would rather just bully someone into my beliefs, right? Like I'm going to just talk all my data at you and I'm going to get you to believe me. And then at the end I'll win because you'll know I'm right. And that wins nobody, right? At the end I might feel like, oh, I really stood up for my beliefs. But at the end of the day, I've probably pushed whoever I was having this conversation with further from whatever point I was trying to get them to consider, because I've tried to dominate them into beliefs. But if I instead say, tell me what's important to you, right? Like, let me hear what your values are, and let's think about how we are alike in these maybe 10,000 foot levels, right? Like people are important. Okay, let's start there. And then from that, we can start to think about what might this mean for the particular area that we're trying to advance, right? If I'm trying to get you to see science differently, or if I'm trying to tell you something about my religious convictions, we have to think about how can we cross the bridge and then walk with the person that we're having a conversation with, rather than hollering at them from the other side saying, come over here, you idiot, right? Like that's not an effective strategy.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And, one of the things I've appreciated about AAAS's work, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and DOZER, their work in, ethics and religion and science, is that when it came to the Science for Seminaries grant, the gatekeepers, if you will, I don't really like that language, but just for the sake of time, the gatekeepers were the seminary profs. As they engaged with scientists, they still had to frame it in light of the curriculum, the doctrinal confessional standpoint, which helped alleviate some of the angst for some constituents, because the seminary profs still, who share our doctrines, share our values in some ways, are still navigating this. That was helpful. Or when they bring pastors and scientists together, where it's a little different point, but it's still bringing people together who might not normally be together, but there was still some basis for trust. There's a mediating organization that's built enough trust between the two parties, like AAAS, where they're trying to be, not that they're a faith-based group, but they're for the common good. So they're saying, we're for you as pastors being pastors, we're for the scientists being scientists, wherever they are on faith commitments. But I think that's still part of the value congruence that help people move toward one another, not always to agree with one, but to move toward one another, even in the disagreements is so key. What are some practical recommendations, in addition to the good recommendations you've already made, recommendations as a scientist that you could make to foster even further constructive conversations between the faith and science community? So in addition to value congruence, in addition to the discussion on binary and the like, are there other recommendations you would make in your work on helping communities have these discussions, Erin?
Yeah. So I think that the biggest thing that is, and one of the biggest things and one of the most important things is that we just listen. And that sounds so rudimentary, and yet it is so hard. I mean, I even think about this when my husband and I have a disagreement. I have to decide, okay, do I really want to value who he is as a person and listen to his perspective, or do I want to try to win and just get him to disengage so that way I can get what I want, right? Like what is my goal? And we have to differentiate between like these short-term goals. Okay, I might win this one, but what have I done long-term in the relationship if I choose that route? So we have these short-term goals and long-term goals. And I think if we take a long-term perspective, if we really listen to someone, and people who do this work really well will say that if you are talking about what you think in the first couple of conversations with someone, you're doing it wrong. I remember a couple years ago, I think it was John Lennox, I had the opportunity to hear from him, and he said, I make it a goal to every first conversation I have with someone, never answer a question, but always ask them questions. So that they don't even realize that I'm not answering the questions, but it's because I want to be intentional about knowing who they are. Right, and that might be a little extreme. Maybe you need to also do a little bit of self-disclosure, but I think that the point of that is really interesting, because how many times do we have conversations where you hear this kind of key word and then you stop listening to what they're saying because you want to make sure that you come back to that brilliant thought you just had. But in that, you miss the person. And all of these conversations are between people. And so for me as a Christian, I think if I really take the idea of God's image seriously, I need to value and respect people. And I can't do that unless I know them, unless I'm in relationships with them. I can't see them unless I value them enough to listen. And then, of course, as a scientist, I think, how does good communication happen? Well, we got to listen to people. We have to hear them. We have to see them. And so all of these principles, I mean, they really coalesce on there should be maybe a little bit less of me and my agenda and a little bit more of who are you? Tell me about yourself. Tell me what's important to you. And in the context of those relationships, there is freedom and safety for potentially threatening conversations, especially conversations at the intersection of science and faith, but of course not limited to those kinds of discussions. And when we listen very carefully, which is really hard to do, I think we are that inclines us toward a perspective of humility, both interpersonal humility, but also intellectual humility, that, hey, there actually are different ways of seeing this same problem. And although I think I'm right, which is why I think the things I do, there's a chance that I'm not. Yeah. And I think that's a really healthy perspective, right? I have these beliefs because I believe there's good evidence for that, but that doesn't mean that I am right on absolutely every single one of my beliefs. That is probably not the case, right? And so when I actively listen and I hear and start to understand others' perspectives and viewpoints, it builds in me this sense of, okay, I have these beliefs for a reason, but let's really think about them, especially from that perspective, which might be brand new to me. And I think it's a really important step.
You know, you're actually providing family counsel. This is not just faith and science. It's politics. It relates to how we engage other religions or faith traditions. It's even like you were saying, your husband and you, how you have discussions, discourse, is it about winning this? I might win this little battle, but I'm going to lose the war in the home and such. And I think we have a lot to learn about this across the spectrum. This discussion as we started out, and it's serving as the parameters, faith and science, the structures of how we engage rationally and psychologically, listening. It pertains to every area of life, doesn't it? And so, when we think about engaging other faith traditions, a friend of mine, Buddhist priest, who we worked together for many years until he died of a massive heart attack, he said, people love the extremes. They love to be at the extremes. Our society caters to that. To be in the middle is really a prophetic place to be. And it's not that we're going to somehow just give up on our convictions. It's to listen, to engage one another openly. That takes humility. It's hard work. It's a lot harder than we think, but that's so needed. And I would just love to see that in this political season. We all have strong views, or we should have strong views. I'm not saying we should take away strength of views, but we should also have strength of relationship in our society. And that's often suffering. We might win a battle, whatever the side is on a political issue, but we're going to lose the war culturally in the way we're going. And so I wanted to save the following questions for later in the interview, and we're building on what we've already been talking about. But why do you care about this subject of fostering constructive conversations on faith and science? You haven't announced yourself yet. You said, you want to wait till later, but I wanted to save this question about, you're really passionate about it. I think it's very important that I ask at times interviewees, why does this matter so to them? And then why should our viewers and our listeners care about this, Dr. Smith?
Yeah. So I remember as a graduate student, so as an undergrad and a graduate student, I don't think I did care about these issues until about halfway through my graduate career. So as a graduate student, I studied the cultural and the cognitive influences on what people believe about origins, right? So thinking about creation, evolution, and the shades in between and other options, right? So what do people believe? And then I also thought about, and what do they actually understand about evolutionary theory? Is there a connection between beliefs and knowledge? And how is this impacted by culture and certain cognitive predictions, these types of things? And I remember one day being asked by a fellow student, so what do you think about these things? And I was like, that doesn't matter because that's not what I'm studying. I'm studying what other people think, right? And then I remember coming home and having a conversation with my husband. He said, that was a really disingenuous answer. And I thought, ooh, this is spouse, that hurts, but it's true. It was an entirely disingenuous answer. And so for me, thinking about these questions is a matter of integrity. That I can't, so, and I mean integrity in a very broad sense here. So if I want to, for example, tell someone, look, I want to tell you something about Jesus. I think this is pretty important. I think it's kind of fundamentally reshaped the way we understand the world. Grace is this thing. We should talk about this. But then out of the other side of my mouth, I'm like, oh yeah, reject that of science that everybody believes. And I'm not even going to talk about that. And, no, yeah, I don't see color. I'm blind to race, right? Like if I'm saying all of these things that just don't square with the data, why would they take this serious? Right? Why would they want to have a conversation with me? And so for me, thinking about how do we have these conversations, I think that's important culturally, if we want to think about transforming kind of what it means to who are the talking heads that are being represented. But then I think it's important at a personal level. How am I thinking about this? And am I doing the hard work of really examining my beliefs, kind of all the beliefs, to try to have a belief system encompassing beliefs about science and beliefs about my religious faith that makes sense, right? Have I constructed what we might call a scientific theory about the way the world works in a way that we can have honest conversations? And so what I don't want to communicate is that you have to just kind of hook, line, sinker, accept everything that a scientist says, right? That would be kind of putting science above other forms of knowledge. But I think what I am saying is that you can't outright reject something without really engaging with it. So when you find out, oh, hey, look, 97% of scientists say the climate is changing and it's because of human activity. If I want to reject that, I can't just say, oh, well, I reject that. I have to actually engage with it and think about it. And in doing so, I might actually change my mind. I believe that's what would happen because that's where the data points. But in doing that hard work, I now, when I have a conversation, say, but you have this weird belief over there. I say, yeah, let's talk about that belief because I've thought through it. And maybe I can learn from you, right? And it helps me adopt that posture. And so I am passionate because I think if we have more people like that, right? And I'm not saying I am a perfect example of that. This is something that's still very much in progress for me. But if we all were a little more willing to kind of reflect on our beliefs and really think through, why do I believe these things? And are there other ways of thinking about these same problems? I think if we were all a little more willing to do that, we would have more productive conversations. So for me, again, about like some of these core issues, right? And so if you are a Christian watching this and you want someone to take you seriously as a Christian, then you need to recognize that there's lots of information that might not be religious in nature, but it's still related to the world that you inhabit, that you believe God created, right? And so we need to think through those with integrity and honesty to the data and in light of where we are as a culture and other types of issues. So for me, it's a primarily an integrity issue.
Integrity involving honesty.
In the log, right?
Amen. I think that should be true for all of us. So lastly, what are your aspirations for the research you are doing in this domain? And where can people find out more about your findings and what other scholars and resources are available in this field?
Thank you for that question. I'd like to answer some questions, right? That's what scientists want to do. We want to answer some questions. So I talked a little bit earlier about implicit bias, for example, and that when it comes to kind of the relationship between science and religion, I think there is some evidence that when we hear science, there's like a package of beliefs and that it might include atheism in there. That's an implicit bias, but is there kind of really good evidence for that? And if so, what does that mean? Especially as we think about Christian engagement with science. And if there's evidence for that, what could we do about it? Right? How can we equip our religious communities to perhaps see science as a way of studying God's good earth, right? And that science for many people can be a religious experience. There's some fascinating work looking at scientists' experience of awe and wonder, right? So when they dive in and they're looking at the chromosomes and they're studying the amoebas moving around, right? I don't do any of that work, so I don't know the details there, but they experience a sense of awe and wonder the way a Christian might when they're in worship. And so for a Christian in the laboratory, might that be a viable form of worship? And how do we respect that? I just think that I would love to be a part of those conversations. You ask, what are my goals for my research? To advance knowledge in a way that can contribute to improving what's happening, especially in our communities of faith. Removing this kind of false belief that it's an either or, and really encouraging members of the religious community to be thoughtful, to be nuanced, and to recognize that different people have different strengths, and you might experience God the most, in the front row of your worship service, and someone else might experience it when they're watching that beaker bubble, right? And both of those are incredible ways of experiencing God. And so I'd love to be a part of that conversation, thinking about what psychology, kind of from a meta view, might be able to contribute to making that better. And in terms of where individuals can find out more, they can check out my faculty page on CBU, and then of course I'd be happy to answer any additional questions at that point and direct folks to some fabulous resources. As there's a lot of great people doing work in this area. It just hasn't hit a tipping point yet, I don't think. So it's not quite kind of like burst onto the scene, but it's there if you know where to look. And so I'd be happy to point anybody in those directions as necessary.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Erin Smith, a psychologist who is working on the interface of faith and science and moving beyond conflict thesis disengagement to constructive engagement. Again, as I had indicated earlier, she is the Associate Professor of Psychology and the Director of the Research for the Center of the Study of Human Behavior at California Baptist University. Dr. Smith, thanks so much for your time today and your thoughtful and really stellar engagement of such complex issues. I'm deeply grateful. Thank you very much. And on behalf of New Wine Tastings and Dr. Smith, I'm Paul Louis Metzger. Thank you for joining us for New Wine Tastings. Blessings to you all.